I used to believe Sophie and I were inseparable. There was no Claire without Sophie, no Sophie without Claire. That's how it had always been, from kindergarten to college, through every milestone that mattered. When my dad passed away, Sophie didn't just hold me together, she became my anchor, the one person I knew I could always count on. We got matching tattoos after graduation, forever by your side. I meant it. At least, I thought I did. Looking back, I see it now, how it started. Little moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but in hindsight, they were warnings. Sophie hated when I spent time with anyone else. She'd pout or make snide comments, but then she'd laugh it off like it was a joke. "I'm just your jealous bestie," she'd say, smiling, but her eyes always lingered a little too long. At first, I thought it was sweet. She cared so much. Who wouldn't want a best friend like that? But then it got worse. She'd show up at my house unannounced, claiming she was just in the area. She'd get moody when I didn't immediately reply to her texts. The real cracks started to show when I got serious about someone. Daniel, my boyfriend in college. Sophie never liked him, though she never said it outright. She'd make comments, little things. "Don't you think he's too possessive?" Or, "Are you sure he's the one? You deserve better." I brushed it off. I told myself she was just being protective. When Daniel disappeared during our senior year, I was devastated. He left for a coffee run one morning and never came back. The police didn't find any leads. Sophie was there, comforting me, crying with me. I clung to her like a lifeline. She was all I had left. Years went by and life moved on. Or at least, I tried to move on. I got a good job offer in another city. I didn't tell Sophie right away. Part of me was afraid of how she'd react, but I couldn't put it off forever. When I finally told her, she went quiet for a moment. Then she smiled. "That's amazing," she said, but her voice sounded wrong. A week later, we had a fight. It wasn't even about the move, at least, not directly. She accused me of pulling away from her, of forgetting what we meant to each other. "I've been there for you through everything," she snapped. "How can you just leave?" I told her she was being unreasonable, that this was my life and my decision. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. 2 days later, Sophie called and asked me to come over. "I want to fix this," she said, her voice soft and apologetic. "I hate fighting with you. Can we just talk?" I hesitated, but I agreed. She was my best friend after all. Her house felt different when I arrived. Too quiet, the air heavy like something was waiting to happen. Sophie greeted me with her usual bright smile, but her eyes, they were wild. There was something in them I couldn't place. She led me to the living room, where a scrapbook was sitting on the coffee table. "I want to show you something," she said, her voice too calm, "to remind you how much I care." The scrapbook was old, the leather cover worn and cracked. I opened it, expecting photos of us, memories of our friendship. But it wasn't that. The first page was a newspaper clipping about Daniel, his disappearance. The next page had a lock of his hair taped to it. My stomach turned. "Sophie, what is this?" I whispered. "Proof," she said, sitting down beside me. Her voice was soft, almost tender. "Proof of how far I'd go for you, for us." I kept flipping the pages, my hands trembling. There were more clippings, missing persons reports, obituaries. Tucked between them were little trinkets, a ring, a bracelet, a photo with a torn edge. My breath hitched when I recognized one of the faces. It was Mia, my coworker, my friend. I had introduced her to Sophie only once, at a coffee shop a few weeks ago. She was smiling in the photo, but now the sight of her made my blood run cold. "Where's Mia?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Sophie's smile widened. "Come with me." She led me down the hallway, to the basement door. I didn't want to go. My legs felt like they were moving on their own, each step heavier than the last. The basement was dark, the air damp and suffocating. Sophie flicked on the light, and there she was. Mia, bound to a chair, her head slumped forward. Blood dripped from her mouth, pooling on the concrete floor. She wasn't moving. I staggered back, my stomach churning. "Sophie, what the hell have you done?" "I saved her," Sophie said, her voice laced with a strange kind of pride. "She was coming between us. I couldn't let her ruin what we have." Tears blurred my vision. "This isn't saving her. My voice broke. "You killed her." "She was a sacrifice," Sophie said, stepping closer. "For us, for our friendship. You don't understand now, but you will." I shook my head, backing away. "No, this is insane." Sophie's expression hardened. She reached behind her and pulled out a knife, holding it out to me. The blade glinted in the harsh basement light, still wet with Mia's blood. "Prove it," she said. "Prove you're still my best friend. Help me get rid of her." I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My body felt frozen, my mind screaming at me to run. "If you don't help me," Sophie said, her voice cold and steady, "then you're just as bad as she was. You'll leave me, abandon me. And you know what happens to people who leave me." My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to fight back, to scream, to do something. But the knife was in my hand before I even realized what I was doing. Sophie was watching me, waiting, her eyes burning with something unhinged. "I can't," I whispered. "I can't do this." Her smile faded, replaced by a look of betrayal so intense it felt like a knife to my chest. "Then you've made your choice," she said. And in that moment, I knew. If I didn't stop her, I would be next. When I think about my mom, I remember warmth, her soft hands smoothing my hair when I cried, the way she used to hum while stirring batter for cookies, her laugh filling every corner of the house like sunlight breaking through a storm. She was my safe place, my constant. Growing up, it felt like nothing could touch me as long as she was around. Even as I got older, when life grew more complicated, she never stopped being my anchor. I'd call her after bad dates or stressful exams, and her voice always had this way of making everything feel manageable. She called me her heart, walking outside her body. I believed her. She loved me fiercely, completely. I never thought that love could twist into something dark, something suffocating. It started small. After I moved out, her calls became more frequent. At first, I didn't mind. I'd pick up, and she'd ask about my day, my job, my plans. She'd remind me to lock my doors, eat healthy, wear a jacket if it was cold. It was sweet, endearing even. But over time, her concerns started feeling less like love and more like surveillance. She'd ask why I wasn't home at certain times, why I hadn't answered her texts right away. When I mentioned new friends or coworkers, she'd subtly pick them apart, finding flaws I hadn't even considered. Then there was Kyle. He was different from the other guys I'd dated. Kind, patient, grounded. He didn't play games, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could see a future with someone. Mom wasn't thrilled. She smiled when I introduced them, but it never quite reached her eyes. She said he was polite but distant, said there was something off about him. I brushed it off. Mom had always been protective, and I figured she just needed time to warm up to him. But time didn't help. She started making comments. Little things at first, like how he seemed too quiet or too charming. Then she escalated. She said she'd seen him flirting with someone at a cafe, even though I knew he'd been at work. She said he was hiding something, that I couldn't trust him. It got to the point where I stopped mentioning him altogether, just to avoid the arguments. The night everything shattered started like any other. Mom called me, her voice soft and cheerful, and said she had a surprise for me. She wanted me to come over after work, just the two of us, like old times. I was exhausted but agreed. She sounded so excited, so genuine. I didn't have the heart to say no. When I got there, the house smelled like cinnamon, just like it always did when she baked. She greeted me at the door with a hug, holding me tight like she hadn't seen me in years. Her eyes were bright, almost too bright, and her smile felt strained, though I couldn't put my finger on why. "Come down to the basement," she said. "I've been working on something special." The basement had always been her domain. She used it as a workspace for her crafts, and as kids, my friends and I used to joke about how it looked like a lair with its dim lighting and cluttered shelves. I followed her down the creaky steps, the air growing colder with each step. When I reached the bottom, I froze. Kyle was there, tied to a chair in the center of the room. His head hung low, blood dripping from a gash on his temple. His face was pale, his shirt stained red. My heart stopped, my breath catching in my throat. "Mom," I whispered, stepping back. What is this?" She turned to me, calm, composed, like she hadn't just shattered my entire world. "I did this for you, sweetheart," she said. "I found out he was going to leave you. He didn't love you, not like he should. I couldn't let him hurt you." Kyle groaned, his head lolling to the side. He tried to speak, but the gag in his mouth muffled his words. My knees felt weak. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. "Mom, untie him," I said, my voice shaking. "You've made a mistake." "No mistake," she said, stepping toward Kyle. She picked up a knife from the table beside him, the blade glinting in the dim light. "He's like the others, Anna. They never deserved you. But it's okay now. You're safe." "Others?" The word barely escaped my lips. She looked at me, her expression softening like she was talking about a cherished memory. "Oh, Anna, you were always so trusting. But I've been protecting you for years. That boy in college who broke your heart? He didn't just disappear. And your friend Julie, she wasn't good for you. She would have dragged you down." I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. My mind raced, connecting dots I hadn't even known were there. The people who had vanished from my life, the strange circumstances, the whispered warnings I'd ignored. It had always been her. Before I could move, before I could even think, she turned back to Kyle and slashed his throat. The sound of the knife cutting through flesh, the wet gurgle as he choked on his own blood. It's burned into my memory. I screamed, backing into the wall as Kyle's head slumped forward, blood pooling on the floor. Mom turned to me, wiping the blade clean with a dish rag. "You don't have to thank me," she said, her voice gentle. "We're stronger together now. No one else can come between us." I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was caving in. She reached out to me, her blood-streaked hands trembling with something close to joy. "You understand, don't you? It's always been you and me. It always will be." My world fractured in that moment. Everything I thought I knew about her, about myself, crumbled. She wasn't the mother who baked cookies during storms, who taught me to ride a bike, who threw me that party after graduation. She was a monster, and somehow I hadn't seen it. "Anna," she said, stepping closer. "Say something." I opened my mouth, but no words came out. The knife was still in her hand. The blood was still on the floor. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. She smiled, tilting her head. "It's okay, sweetheart. You don't have to be scared. I did this for us." But I wasn't scared of Kyle. I was scared of her. And I didn't know if I'd ever stop being scared. When I moved into my new apartment, I felt like I'd finally found a place where I could start fresh. It was small but cozy, with big windows that let in plenty of sunlight, and it sat on the edge of a quiet neighborhood. On my first day there, as I struggled to haul boxes up the narrow staircase, An older man stepped out of the apartment across the hall. He was tall and thin, with a kind smile and a soft voice. "Need a hand?" he asked. That's how I met Mr. Whitaker. He insisted on helping me carry the heavier boxes, despite my protests. By the time we were done, I was exhausted and grateful. He introduced himself as Henry Whitaker, a retired professor. When he saw me fumbling with a leaking pipe under my sink later that week, he appeared with a wrench and a cheerful determination to fix it. Over the next few weeks, he'd knock on my door with homemade cookies, or a book he thought I'd enjoy. His apartment was a reflection of him, cozy and full of character. Plants crowded every windowsill, their leaves trailing down like green waterfalls. A plush, well-worn armchair sat in one corner, surrounded by towering bookshelves filled with novels and academic texts. Over tea, he told me stories about his teaching days, his love for classical music, and the joy he found in gardening. He reminded me of my grandfather, gentle, attentive, and warm. At first, I couldn't have asked for a better neighbor, but then little things started to bother me. Late at night, I'd hear him pacing, the floorboards creaking rhythmically above my head. Sometimes, when I'd glance out my window, I'd see him sitting in the dark, staring out his window at the street below. He always seemed to know when I'd had a bad day, showing up at my door with tea or advice before I even mentioned anything. I told myself he was just observant, maybe a little lonely. It didn't feel like a reason to worry. Then people started disappearing. The first was a college student, a girl named Becca, who lived on the first floor. She was the kind of person you couldn't help but notice. Always laughing, always chatting with everyone in the building. One day, she just stopped showing up. No one seemed to know where she'd gone, and the landlord said she'd moved out suddenly. But I'd seen her the night before she vanished, struggling with groceries in the lobby. She'd been wearing a bright yellow coat. I couldn't shake the feeling something was off. A few days later, I noticed a terrible smell in the hallway outside Mr. Whitaker's apartment. It was sharp, sour, and sickly sweet all at once, like rotting meat. I mentioned it to him when I saw him next. He waved it off, saying he'd accidentally left some spoiled food in the fridge. The smell disappeared after that, but unease settled in my stomach like a stone. One night, a week after Becca disappeared, Mr. Whitaker knocked on my door. He had that same kind smile, but there was something different in his eyes, something intense, almost desperate. He asked if I could come over to see a special project he'd been working on. He said he valued my opinion. I hesitated, the unease from earlier flaring up, but I didn't want to offend him. He'd been so kind to me. Against my better judgment, I followed him across the hall. His apartment smelled faintly of bleach, and the plants that had once made the space feel so vibrant now seemed to loom, their shadows twisting in the dim light. He led me down a hallway I hadn't noticed before, to a door I'd assumed was just a closet. "You're going to love this," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. He opened the door, and the world seemed to tilt beneath me. The room was small and windowless, illuminated by a single hanging bulb that cast harsh shadows on the walls. Tools lined the shelves, knives, saws, things I couldn't even name. In the center of the room was a chair, and in the chair was Becca. Her yellow coat was gone, replaced by a torn, blood-stained t-shirt. She was barely conscious, her head lolling forward, her arms tied down with thick rope. Bruises bloomed across her skin, and her lips were cracked and dry. My stomach churned, and I stumbled back, hitting the wall. "Do you see now?" Mr. Whitaker said, stepping into the room. "This is my work, my purpose." I couldn't speak. My eyes were locked on Becca, on the slow rise and fall of her chest. She was alive. Barely. "She was rotten," he continued, his voice calm, almost soothing. "People like her, they infect neighborhoods like ours. Loud, disrespectful. But I took care of her, just like I've taken care of others." "Others?" My voice came out in a whisper, strangled with horror. He smiled and walked to a small table in the corner. From it, he picked up a stack of photographs and handed them to me. My hands shook as I flipped through them. Faces of people I recognized, tenants, delivery drivers, a woman who used to walk her dog past the building every morning. All of them were gone now. "I knew you'd understand," he said, watching me with a mix of pride and expectation. "You've always been so kind, so thoughtful. I knew you'd see the necessity of it." My throat tightened, and I could barely breathe. "You're insane." His expression darkened. He took a step closer, his calm demeanor cracking just enough to let the menace seep through. "I've been watching you, Lisa. You've got potential. You're clever, and you've got an eye for people. I could teach you. You could help me make this neighborhood a better place." I backed away, but the room was too small, and he was between me and the door. "And if you don't want to help," he continued, his voice cold now, "then I suppose you'll end up like her." He gestured toward Becca. Terror surged through me, but I knew I couldn't show it. I forced myself to nod, to keep my voice steady. I understand," I lied. "You're right. People like her. They ruin everything." His smile returned, soft and approving. "I knew you'd see it my way." I don't know how I got through the rest of that night. I nodded, I smiled, I agreed with everything he said. When he finally let me leave, I barely made it back to my apartment before collapsing in a shaking heap. Now, I'm sitting here, writing this, trying to figure out what to do. If I call the police, he'll know it was me. And I don't know if I'll survive that. But if I stay quiet, if I do nothing, how many more people will he take?